This is CounterPoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. Global security is becoming more volatile day by day. China is expanding its military reach across the Indo Pacific while grappling with internal political and military upheaval. In the Middle East, tensions involving Iran continue to threaten regional stability, global energy markets, and the strategic interests of the United States and its allies. And then there's Venezuela, where the U.S. has promised to attract massive energy investment and revenue, yet political instability provides little reassurance to both energy investors and regional allies with security concerns. Meanwhile, from Ukraine to Taiwan, long-standing assumptions about deterrence, military readiness, and Western resolve are being tested. For Canada, these developments raise fundamental questions. Are we prepared for a world defined by great power competition? Can we continue to rely on the United States for our security while underinvesting in our own defense capabilities? And as Washington confronts challenges from Beijing, Tehran, Moscow simultaneously, where does Canada fit into the broader strategic picture? On today's show, we'll discuss China's growing ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, the evolving confrontation between Iran, the United States, and its regional allies, Venezuela, of course, the future of Canada-US continental defense, and what these developments reveal about Canada's readiness for an increasingly dangerous world. And joining me for this discussion is security and intelligence expert Joe Varner. Professor Varner is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the Center for North American Prosperity and Security in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to join you, Tana.
Excellent. This is a very important discussion, not only because obviously global security is very important, but how Canada fits into that puzzle is of huge importance to our nation. So, for example, let's start with China. China has been a concern for multiple years. Recently, you suggested that Canada rather should pay closer attention to China, and especially as there are military purges and its ambitions. What do these recent military purges indicate to us about Xi Jinping's stability and his leadership? And what kind of risks do you feel they pose for Canada and its allies?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that, China's purges, the purges that are going on now within the officer corps and the senior leadership of the Chinese military are a major concern because it goes to stability of the country. And when a country starts to purge its leadership of its strategic nuclear deterrent, that's a cause for immediate concern. And it's been ongoing. So China's strategic rocket forces have seen a number of their senior military leaders removed. We've seen two defense ministers removed, senior members of the Central Military Commission, which is the most powerful body in China, and several top scientists and top executives in the defense industrial complex. And this all goes to stability. It all goes to tighter political control of the military. It means that military advice is probably going to be muted in favor of the political leadership and what the political leadership wants,
Now, as it relates to
whether it's
Canada,
good for the country or.
no, absolutely. As it relates to Canada, like many in Canada, have called for a kind of warned against a renewed close relationship between Canada and China, and a cautious approach to engagement with Beijing. What lessons do you feel Canadian policymakers failed to learn, for example, from the Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor episode?
Well, I think that they have failed to learn that China is a coercive power. It is a non-status quo power. It wants to change the world order. It wants to assert itself globally in a manner that we've seen in terms of its bullying in the South China Sea, its bullying on the Indian Chinese border, and its sanction breaking moves with regard to Iran and other countries. China doesn't shy away from using any coercion or any device. It engages in foreign influence, foreign espionage, and it engages democracies in ways that undermine that democracy. And
Okay.
so in Canada's case, it seems like the government's willing to take any risk and with no guardrails to engage the Chinese. And that was a failure under Trudeau, and I suspect it will be a massive failure under Kearney.
Okay. We're going to pick up this discussion just a few moments. Welcome back to CounterPoint as we discuss global security. And joining me for that discussion is Joe Varner, who's a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Joe, thanks again for joining me today. As we're discussing and kind of unpacking what's happening in China, we do know that Canada has significant economic interests in China. They're a trading partner. How do we balance Canada's economic needs with the growing security concerns, both with China and what could potentially spill out in that region?
I think the biggest issue is this move by the Kearney government to pivot away from the United States. Geography, trade, and military interests are not going to change, but trying to swap them out first for the Europeans and now for China, I think puts the Canadian economy at risk. I mean, China in the last week or so has been engaged in activities around Taiwanese islands and particularly Paradise Island. Uh, and if the Chinese make a move on those islands or they cause further disruption in the South China Sea, Canada's going to have some very hard choices to make if we've pivoted away from the United States, lost markets there and lost market share, and gone whole hog into China. We're going to be in a real space with our allies, and we're going to be in a real space with the Chinese where they can put pressure on us.
Let's pivot now and discuss. Well, actually, let's talk about the United States because you brought up them. They're very important allies. Recently, the United States has paused this partnership with a Canadian-U.S. defense initiative. How dependent, not just economically, but defensive-wise, how dependent is Canada on the United States for defense?
Canada cannot defend itself with its current military and could not defend itself alone in any case. Canada's always relied on alliances, first the British Empire and then Pax Americana with the American leadership of the free world in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that's not going to change. Canada relies on alliances, NATO, NORAD, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance for its security. And, for many years, Canada has been kind of a freeloader in the defense and foreign policy realm. We keep talking about, our government keeps talking about how we um, um, punch above our weight, but the reality is something starkly different.
Now, one of the concerns we've heard repeatedly from Trump with many NATO partners is that, especially Canada, is that we underfund our defense, and that we need to prioritize that more if we're going to work with them, if you will. What kind of investments would you like to see, or do you think Canada ought to make to bolster its defense so that we remain a credible defense partner?
Well, I think we have to move forward with the F-35 purchase, and we have to get on with it. It's dragged on for a decade and a half, and it's ridiculous. It's the only fifth generation stealth aircraft out there that Canada has an option to purchase, and it's won the competition in Canada. So I think that considering a mixed fleet with the Gripen is problematic, and it's time to get on with the F-35 purchase. I think it was the right move to purchase an AWACS aircraft. I'm not sure that the Saab Bombardier aircraft is the aircraft to go with, but I think that was the right move. We need to get submarines in the water in our to protect the flanks of the Northwest Passage and protect Canadian sovereignty in the north. And I think we have a massive re-equipment job to do with the Navy is facing rust out. The Army needs a lot of equipment. It doesn't have equipment that most Western armies have, and it's now leading the NATO brigade in Latvia. So there's a lot of work to be done. But the government says that it's reached 2% of GDP. keep in mind that that there's a little bit of voodoo math in our reaching 2% of GDP, and it's not clear that our allies are going to agree that those numbers are what the government of Canada says they are. The Coast Guard fleet is now included in those numbers. It's not an armed fleet, and it's a unionized service. The Transport Canada air fleet is now included in those numbers, and spending in, I think, somewhere along the neighborhood of 14 other government departments
Wow.
that the government says is part of our defense spend. It adds nothing to lethality and nothing to the combat capability of the Canadian Forces.
Okay. Well, we're going to pick up this discussion when we come back, and we're also going to pivot and discuss what's happening in Iran and what that could mean for Canada and global security at large. We'll be right back. Welcome back to CounterPoint. I'm joined by Joe Varner, who's a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, as we discuss global security and what certain hotspots could mean for Canada and in the future of the world. Joe, thanks again for being here. Let's pivot now and talk about the Middle East and Iran. This is obviously a topic that has dominated headlines for the last few months. You've suggested that there's a possibility that there could be failed negotiations. And if that happens with Iran, there's obviously a risk of a wider conflict. What do you see the most likely scenario if diplomacy breaks down completely?
Diplomacy breaks down completely. I think that the United States is going to be forced to take military action, and in particular to force open the Straits of Hormuz. A ship was apparently hit this morning by what's probably an Iranian projectile of some form, and the engine room's on fire on that tanker. This can't be allowed to continue. 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas comes out of the Gulf, and Iran's control of the Persian Gulf is just completely unacceptable.
Yeah, I don't know how that path forward could, because I mean, obviously, this has had ramifications on the global energy markets. Um, and it almost seems as if I mean, of course, we don't know what's going on in the back room. Maybe you do, I don't. But that there has been maybe a strategic misstep. You've even spoken about the Iran strategy gap. What are the biggest mistakes you feel the US and the Western governments are making in their approach to Tehran today?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there is one major problem in the Middle East, and that major problem is Iran. Uh, it's a problem for its own people, and it's a problem for its neighbors. It's definitely a problem for the Western world. The fact of the matter is, you know, Iran has shown no willingness in negotiations over decades to rein in its nuclear program and to dismantle it. It has increased its missile and drone forces to the point that they are a regional threat. It uses proxy militias to undermine security throughout the region. The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and a whole series of militias in Iraq and previously in Syria. These proxy forces are part of Iran's strategy of deterring a Western response, just like they now have the Strait of Hormuz that they're trying to use to deter a Western response. And so Iran presents a major threat to everyone. And Iran's missile launch at Diego Garcia out in the Indian Ocean, the range of a missile to do that would put most of Western Europe within range of Iranian missiles now. And
Wow.
that's a major, major problem.
No, that is a very, very major concern. And then when we discuss the Strait of Hormuz, which again, for most Canadians was never even something in their lexicon up until a few months ago, I most probably Canadians didn't realize how much energy actually passes through that strait and how disruptive a choke point like that could be if it's if there are problems and political issues. How vulnerable is the global economy to disruption there, and what role do you think Canada could play in protecting not only maritime security but also protecting supply and gas, maybe with further investment here in Canada?
Yeah, what I would say is that the Strait of Hormuz, a lot of the world's energy comes out of it. 20% again of oil and liquefied natural gas. most of that goes to Asia. But aviation fuel, a lot of aviation fuel comes out of that area, out of the Persian Gulf, and goes to Europe. And so the Europeans have been facing shortages on aviation fuel. So it's very important to the world, and very important, particularly to U.S. and Canadian allies and friends in Asia. What I would say is, you know, Canada, our options to help out with any sort of multilateral mission after the fact, after there's peace and demining, is going to be hampered by the fact we have no forward deployed assets.
Mm.
So, the government, says that, they might help out their allies when the French and British go in to try and demine the Persian Gulf. But until we get some assets forward deployed and ready to go, it's kind of more a communication strategy than a reality in terms of defense. And you're spot on. Canada has an enormous potential for energy, for critical minerals, rare earth minerals. We have to do more to bring up our natural resources.
Welcome back to CounterPoint. We're wrapping up our discussion on global security, and we're joined by Joe Varner for that conversation. Joe, let's pivot to Venezuela. We haven't heard much about Venezuela in the global headlines. However, we do know that U.S. President Donald Trump is still trying to drum up investment into that region for energy investment, of course. What is the situation security-wise with Venezuela? Do they still pose a risk regionally? Do they pose a risk to Canada? And how is their friendship or relationship with China evolved since Trump, asserted himself there in January?
Well, I guess what I could say is that, in terms of Venezuela, not much has really changed. They've removed Maduro, but the regime itself remains in place. And to what extent it is still engaged with Russia, China, and Iran, I'm not quite sure, but I would suspect that those engagements are still there. Venezuela was the largest base of operations for Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in North America under Maduro. And it certainly was a major point of oil smuggling for Russia. And of course, China was very interested in oil. Because the regime hasn't changed in real terms, still in place, still engaged in business the way it was before, investors are reluctant to go into Venezuela, and that's the problem. And I would say that its oil infrastructure has been seriously degraded over time, just through lack of investment, a lack of upkeep, and growth by the regime. So Venezuela is not quite the crown jewel that it once was. But this is part of a bigger play by the United States to boot Russia and China out of the Western Hemisphere, and particularly out of South America. So you've seen the Americans push the Chinese out of the Panama Canal zone. You've also seen the Americans buckle down on Cuba, a long-standing burr on their side. And you're probably going to see the Americans push the Nicaraguans in the not-too-distant future on China. And they're probably going to go back and forth with the Argentines on a Chinese space base, which is at the foot of Argentina, large antenna that monitors space, which is kind of a shadowy site that likely has more than just civilian applications. It likely has military applications, and it's guarded by the People's Liberation Army. So that site in Argentina is probably going to come into U.S. focus in the not-too-distant future, and they're probably going to push on that as well.
And is there a role for Canada to play with the Venezuela situation? Or is there a role that
I
we
don't think
can
Canada
play?
has. I don't think that there's much that we can do right now with the Venezuelan situation with the regime still in place.
Okay.
It would be very difficult for us to do that. We could engage in diplomacy, and we could, promise to send experts down to help them increase their oil production. but I don't think that they require Canadian assistance, and I suspect that they wouldn't ask for it even if it was offered, and it would put us in a very bad spot with the United States.
Okay, now with respect to Canada and its allies, there's been criticisms that they question Canada's value, and we sort of hinted at this in the earlier segments. What is Canada's value in global security? Uh, what specific actions would convince these allies, such as the United States and the United Kingdom and other NATO partners, that Canada actually is going to be serious about security again?
Well, I think that our allies would expect us to engage in a real a national interest based foreign policy. They would like us to be more than members of alliances like NATO, resting on our laurels as a founding member and as a long time member. Uh, that doesn't really apply in today's world and today's alliances. So Canada has to, one, build up its military muscle and increase its lethality. And that means military forces that are ready, deployable, properly equipped to do business anywhere in the world that they're needed. And right now, Canada does not have that. We're hard pressed. The whole army, pretty well, is maintaining a brigade in Latvia. The Navy is hard pressed with its warships, lack of technicians, aging ships, and the Air Force is being recapitalized, but it takes years to build
Right.
build up that combat capability.
This has been Counterpoint. Thanks for watching.